Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us to the Etiquette of Grief workshop, supporting someone who's grieving the death of a loved one or other important loss. And this is the second in the educational series that follows What is Grief that Megan presented in partnership with the Dorothy Ley Hospice, Heart House Hospice, and the Regional Learning Center. My name is Peggy Moore, and I'm coordinator of bereavement and spiritual care at Heart House Hospice. It's a privilege to talk about and share thoughts about grief and loss because it's a passion of mine. Megan presented the main themes in grief in her presentation, What is Grief? And of course, these apply for all kinds of human loss of life, loss of financial or food security, loss of home, loss of job, loss of relationship, loss of physical connection to others as we've been experiencing during the pandemic. The pandemic itself can be considered a grief journey for the world that includes anticipatory grief, as loved ones are dying alone in hospital or long-term care. In many ways, grief calls us to gather in community, and right now we can't, at least in the same way we could before. Many inspirational and resourceful ideas for staying connected come up every day in the news that point to the creative power and resilience of the human spirit. Now we're going to take this presentation further into how to support, respond to, and be present with grieving people, and how to support, respond to, and be present for yourself if you're grieving now. Hopefully, you'll be able to gather some tips and tricks or tools for the toolbox that might be helpful personally and professionally. After all, understanding relationship dynamics in grief in a spirit of kindness, compassion, and care can be empowering for all. So here's an introductory question for reflection. If you look back over your life when you were grieving the death of a loved one or going through another kind of loss, what's the best thing someone ever said to you? And what was the worst thing someone ever said to you? What's really interesting about this question is that the same phrase can be comforting to one person and upsetting to another. So much can depend on the moment, the mood of the griever, the mood of the person offering support. And there are lots of tip sheets available at the end of this presentation, kind of addressing the best and the worst things to say to a griever. So just some initial thoughts about grief. Grief is a normal, natural, and necessary process embedded in human life from birth onwards. We've all experienced it every time we go through a change or transition, even though we may not have the words to describe it. Consider graduations or moves to new cities or countries, relationship breakups. As well, there's a life cycle for all living beings and plants. Death is a natural part of life, and grief is a natural part of this flow. Writer Parker Palmer would say that to intentionally grieve is to collaborate with nature. There's no right or wrong way to grieve. As a matter of fact, grief is vital to health and well-being as an organic and unfolding process. There would not be grief without the capacity to love or attach to others, as Alan Wolfelt would say, for grief and love are two sides of the same coin. Consider the animal kingdom. Elephants live to 70 years old in close social groups, and they're known to grieve forever for one of their own who has died, initially by rumbling loudly, raising a foot over the body in a sort of natural ritual, and stopping by the place of death when passing by forever. They're also known to experience much joy at birth, trumpeting loudly for all to see and hear. Many other species in the animal kingdom are known to grieve. It's no surprise that pets grieve the death of their owners. And the grief when a pet dies can be especially challenging because others don't see it as important. We live in a society that in many ways stigmatizes grief as being a sign of weakness. Would you agree that most people do not want to talk about death, dying, or grief because it's uncomfortable? This discomfort can isolate grievers and discourage supporters. Consequently, many miscommunications can occur. Consider a woman named Jennifer whose husband has died and she must return to work as a nurse within a week or two. What might she be going through as she returns to work? And what might her coworkers be going through as they welcome her back? We're going to explore in this presentation what might be happening for the griever and the support people, along with skills and tips for offering the support. One of Alan Wolfelt's most helpful tools for both the griever and support people is the rule of thirds. He would suggest that each grieving person can divide their circles of people into thirds as follows. A third may be therapeutic, a third may be neutral, and a third may be unhelpful or even toxic. So from the point of view of the griever, the therapeutic third may include a few individuals from the following groups: friends, family, colleagues, neighbors, faith community, medical professionals, including the family doctor. The therapeutic third can also be professional grief counselor or psychotherapist, a bereavement support group and the participants, as well as people who have come forward as compassionate people who were not friends before. Many people tell me that people they assumed would be supportive are not, and others come into their lives as a nice surprise. The neutral third may include people who are supportive in ways that do not include listening. Perhaps it's good to take a break from grief or going to a movie with these people, going for a walk, talking by phone or by Zoom. And then, of course, the unhelpful or toxic third are those who are not able to respond to vulnerable feelings and grief with compassion for any number of reasons. It can include people from all social groups who are not acquainted with grief or loss and who may mean well and have good intention. It's helpful to realize that these are not necessarily bad people. It doesn't need to be the end of a relationship. The griever may choose, though, to limit time with some of these people for a period of time, especially during a grief burst. The griever sorts this out through trial and error over time. So from the point of view of the support people, it's helpful to know who you are as a support person for someone you know who is grieving. For example, I may be a good listener, I may be good at socializing or distraction, and I may be one of the toxic people for someone who's grieving because I don't have what they need for their grief journey. So it's important to help the grieving person find their own way through the process as best they can. So these are the possible experiences of a grieving person. We'll look at what Jennifer might be experiencing as she returns to work. She may be experiencing any of the many possible grief experiences that Megan presented in What is Grief, but it will be unique to Jennifer, and only Jennifer knows how she thinks and feels in any given moment. It could be fear of her future as an only parent, anxiousness about finances, sadness, guilt, isolated because her family lives overseas, anger at the injustice of what's happened to her, recovery from the role of being a caregiver. No doubt she'll feel vulnerable emotionally, and questions of who am I now, why him, why now will come up, knowing there are no easy answers. You know, the world looks very different and yet the same, like the slight turn of a kaleidoscope can show a different picture. A man recently told me how angry he felt that the world continues to go on while his world has stopped following the death of his child. I often find it helpful to not assume that feelings in grief are rational and logical, but they're real and purposeful. Head and heart are not in sync right now. If Jennifer has a grief burst at work, triggered by a memory or just about anything because grief bursts are so unpredictable, it's helpful to know that it's normal, natural, and necessary to cry. Thank God for tears. Jennifer may need to build strategies on how to handle her grief bursts, which can take some trial and error. There's a natural tendency to want to cocoon as people lose energy and find it hard to keep all the balls in the air. This may be nature's way of providing for an emotional convalescent period for the griever. Jennifer may feel overwhelmed with the workload for a while. On the other hand, some people prefer to stay busy and carry on as normal, nature's anesthetic in a way, and the grief can hit later, sometimes in the second year or even longer. The good news is that grief can be processed at any time, even weeks, months, or years after a loss, through a retrospective lens, and both ways are okay. Part of isolation and grief and the miscommunications that can arise come from not preparing. It's helpful if Jennifer can tell others what's helpful for her. Does she want to just focus on work and leave her grief work to after hours? Does she want to talk a little about her grief at work, and if so, with whom? What's her personality like? Does Jennifer have a supervisor or a colleague with whom she feels safe to share her needs? And if she decides to decline social activities for a time, just realize it's not personal. She's in survival mode right now. Many grievers find it painful to talk about things that would normally feel light and fun. Some more experiences of a grieving person. Sense of existential loneliness and abandonment. Who's going to get me now? Who's going to have my back? Questioning meaning in religious and spiritual understandings, whether one identifies as being religious, spiritual, or secular, is natural. A man questions the fairness when his young wife has died and he's now raising small children. A woman whose husband died, well, they didn't have an active social life together and they were each other's everything. So the woman's tasks now include building a community of support, which takes time. Repeating the story of loss as often as it takes for the person to make sense of it is a task in the work of mourning. The griever must embrace memories of the past for understanding in order to move forward and live life fully in a new way. Sometimes other people can't bear to hear it for any number of reasons. Sometimes the griever expects their circle of care to know what to say and do. I know a grieving 25-year-old woman expressed to me distress that her boyfriend offers advice about fixing her grief. And this is frustrating for both of them. He doesn't want to see her suffer, and she needs space to be able to grieve. Anger at the medical system as a form of protest. In our work at Heart House, death is often from illness, but even a sudden death can raise anger at the medical system as a need to make sense of what's happened as a form of protest. I would invite anyone to protest as long as is needed. It is a complicated healthcare system. Those working in the system and those using the system are often confused about how to access the right supports at the right time. Wearing a mask in public refers to acting as though everything is okay on the outside while suffering greatly on the inside. Of course, this is a helpful strategy for many situations, but grief needs expression somewhere. It's said that unreconciled grief can come out in other ways. And then some grievers experience full acceptance of a loved one's death, possibly a sense of relief, especially if the person is no longer suffering. And now we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about what the circle of care for a grieving person might be going through. Consider suddenly you're face to face with someone who's revealed they are grieving the death of a close loved one or another kind of loss. What do? Do you stay and persevere somehow? Do you end the conversation quickly and leave? Or do you stay but say nothing? These are well-known trauma reactions. The circle of care could be anyone in the family, friends, neighbors, acquaintances, work colleagues, faith community, volunteer, could be any of the healthcare professionals, or even a person at the grocery store. And the circle of care can often feel that deer caught in the headlights feeling and a sense of facing own mortality that, this could happen to me. I remember reading a book many years ago called The Road Less Traveled, and the first sentence in that book is, "Life is difficult." It felt strangely liberating and surprising to me. For sometimes we expect that the norm is happiness and balance, but that's not authentic. Life is more up and down than that, and simply embracing the truth, that truth, can take away some of the pressure. The wholeness of life includes the challenges and the joys. As Megan said, when a wave of grief crashes over, learn how to be a surfer and ride the waves to make it through the challenging times. And even though suffering is embedded in life, it is hard and agonizing sometimes to witness another person's suffering because we naturally are caring people. But it can evoke helplessness when we can't fix something. And if a person is highly emotional in your presence, it's helpful to stay present with them without saying very much. Rushing off can feel like more isolation, and it is a tall order, but possible to develop with skill. Some other experiences of the circle of care can include fear about witnessing crying in another person, or maybe fear of breaking down yourself in front of the other person, or making the assumption that the other person wants to be left alone. Sometimes the feeling of needing to be needed can be what some people experience. It would be helpful to reduce the stigma of grief. Toss out the idea of grief as a weakness. After all, it's not a failure to die or experience loss or to grieve. Getting support in grief can mean better overall health going forward and less stress on the healthcare system. It's ironic that 3 months after a death, when the paperwork is done, a person's ready to talk and start sharing their story, their circles have gone back to their own lives and assume the grieving person has too. "No one is calling me," one griever says. "The support people have all said, call me if you need anything." But the griever won't do that because they often don't know what they need. A griever may say, "Don't make me tell you what I need because I don't even know myself." Sometimes we forget that healthcare professionals grieve too. What happens to their sense of grief and loss when a patient dies? or when a family member of their own becomes ill or dies. Connecting both grievers and their circles of support through compassion, empathy, kindness, and care. Here are a couple of quotes that I find helpful. When we suffer loss or face difficulties of any kind, there's a real desire deep in most people for human connection. If your compassion doesn't include yourself, it's incomplete. And the very fact that we're conscious human beings experiencing life on the planet means we're intrinsically valuable and deserving of care. We don't have to earn the right to compassion. It is our birthright. You know, no matter the themes and theories of grief, what is most healing for a grieving person is kindness, compassion, care from their circles and from themselves. Human connection is as simple as a smile, a glance, a shared joke, a listening ear, basically seeing each other clearly as human beings. It doesn't take any extra time to connect with someone through compassion. Jennifer experienced human compassion when the receptionist in her doctor's office engaged her kindly and shared a joke. Jennifer felt grounded and normal in that encounter. I haven't met too many people who learned as children to care for themselves in the way that's called for in a grief journey. We're more taught to care for others. Consider the oxygen mask in an airplane that comes down in an emergency. We're always instructed to put the oxygen mask on ourselves before putting it on another person, even a child. The metaphor of the oxygen mask will be familiar to those working in helping professions as an ethical imperative, but all grievers are tasked with learning the skill of self-care and compassion. And self-care can start with creating a space in your home that's a sanctuary of some sort, maybe music, a blanket, a journal, candle, some books, for this period of emotional convalescence. Self-care can proceed to no to-do lists and much forgiveness for not being perfect. Parker Palmer would say that grief journey is to engage in self-knowledge, not in self-flagellation. Jennifer had a grief burst at work shortly after returning. She had to leave a meeting. Embarrassed, she later spoke to a trusted colleague, part of her therapeutic third, and felt grounded when the person reminded her of all she'd been through and survived and said, "You got this." This is an example of a self-care strategy. So finding the words of what to say to someone who's grieving, there's a couple things to consider. The type of relationship it is, the cultural, spiritual, family norms, personalities, your experience of grief and loss, and so on. Tailoring acts of kindness to the recipient and the nature of the relationship can be a helpful strategy. If you don't know someone very well, feel free to send a card. For example, someone you've known since childhood is a different relationship from an acquaintance who's a neighbor down the street. These are different levels of friendship and may call for different responses. It's not to say that an acquaintance can't offer a lot of support, but it's just a consideration. Some religious traditions have charity embedded in the faith. Sometimes it's helpful to gauge this with the needs of the family. One of my clients shared that in her religious and cultural tradition, it's common practice to make a condolence call and send flowers. When her father died, all the calls came in immediately as she was leaving the bedside and beginning to make funeral arrangements. She was not prepared for it, but later when she was prepared, everyone left her alone. Another person received many flowers and plants, but found she had no energy to water the flowers or put water in vases. These are simply examples of things to consider, and it's not a rule, no right or wrong. You'll know your own circumstances better than anyone. Finding the words can often mean being truthful and speaking from the heart. One strategy in the book, The Etiquette of Illness, that I find helpful is just pause for a moment, take a few deep breaths, and put your hand to your heart. In a couple of moments, just feel what feels true for you, and then speak it using I language. And switching gears again into some of the things that are unhelpful to say and do. These are things I've heard from clients, I've experienced personally, and I've said myself, but they're not helpful. Sometimes, people say things like, you've got to be strong, you've got to move on with your life, just be happy you're doing as well as you are. Your loved one would not want you to be sad. They were sick for so long, you knew she was going to die, why you shouldn't grieve, and so on. So It's most helpful if the person facing the loss can find their own way through and make their own choices without feeling they're disappointing their loved ones. It's beneficial to trust the person is making an informed decision about their own unique circumstance. The way someone looks on the inside does not mirror what's happening on the outside. I think Megan's mentioned this, and certainly can't be said enough, is that heart and head are not in sync often in the grief journey. It's also a truism that a 95-year-old person who dies doesn't make grief any easier for the loved one, because it's the nature of the relationship that dictates. No doubt they would want another 70 years together. And as far as social situations, it's helpful for the griever to be strategic about their social situations based on their energy level and maybe their sense of vulnerability. So support people are invited to understand when an ill or grieving person is not feeling social. These are special considerations, and it won't be forever. The grieving person is encouraged to continue the bonds and relationship with the person who died. Detachment is not the goal. Over time, the griever will find ways to redefine the relationship so that the bond will continue for life. The deceased will be on the griever's heart forever. Some more unhelpful things to say and do. Since you're a professional, you should be able to sail through the grief journey. Well, the professional knowledge goes out the window when it's personal. I recall people saying to me when a close friend died 12 years ago, "You must be okay when your friend died because of all the knowledge you have." I didn't feel comforted by that. I actually felt a bit minimized and dismissed because the situation was enormous for me, but I knew it was well-meaning because these were my friends and communities. When are you going to go back to normal? The movement really is not back, it's forward to a new normal. For life must be understood backwards but lived forwards. The griever must embrace memories in order to move forward with renewed energy for life. Many support people might view sharing their own story as a way to connect and offer reassurance that they will come through it. And in this way, it's well-intentioned. This is for people who might say, "I know exactly how you feel," and then share your story. But by sharing your own story now, in a way, it minimizes the person living with the current loss. It's not a time for mutual sharing. It's more of a time to stay quiet for the other person. We want to avoid having the grieving person have to comfort the support person. And then sometimes people talking about, it was God's plan and things like that. Sometimes religious or spiritual advice can be a way of disconnecting. Not everyone in the same religion has the same personal faith, and it sometimes can feel unhelpful. For others, it may be very helpful. And then these are just some helpful things to say and do with genuine care. Things like, "I don't know what to say, I just had to call you. How's your day going today?" Realizing that it may be very different tomorrow. "I'm here to listen when you wish, but no pressure." It's not fair. I recall my friend who died 12 years ago. She told me that the only thing that comforted her while she was living with cancer was people who said it's not fair. I know another person who sent an emoji every day for months to a friend who was going through a very difficult life and death situation. She later learned that this small gesture meant the world to the recipient. "Is it okay if I call from time to time? I'm sorry for your loss. I'd love to hear more about your loved one. What were they like?" And most people like to hear that what they're going through is normal, natural, and that there's nothing wrong with them. So some other things to say and do with genuine care: sending a text, a card, an email as soon as you hear about it. It's up to the support person to initiate contact. Leaving a voicemail, a thinking of you. Think about what you like about your friend or colleague, and name those qualities in a card. Sometimes connecting people to their past with a shared memory can be like an anchor at a time that feels chaotic. For example, remember that time we went camping, or remember that time we went away on a business trip together. Making the invitation to get together and let the grieving person decide. It's more empowering at a time when so much feels out of control to let them take control. A note about confidentiality. There may be lots of reasons why a person may want to keep personal information private. So it's up to the grieving person to share the story and be clear about their desire for privacy. Of course, it's okay to laugh with a grieving person. All the human emotions are neither good nor bad, they just are. offering acts of kindness such as buying a gift or making a donation, delivering a meal, restaurant gift card, offering to care for the children or walk the dog, that fit the nature of your relationship and being respectful of the person and what's possible in your own life. I had a client whose wife was dying and they live in a townhouse complex. The neighbors created a system or schedule where dinner was delivered by one different family each night. The dinner was placed outside the door, so there was no pressure for them to entertain or socialize. And he told me how grateful he felt for all the support and that he felt surrounded by care, and this was all nonverbal. Ken Doka is another grief theorist who suggests grievers can divide their circles into thirds, and the thirds are listeners, doers, and respite people. Self-knowledge is so important as a support person. It can be empowering to know my own skills and gifts, for example. Am I a doer? Am I a listener? Am I a respite person? And then I can offer what aligns with my own gifts and talents. And throw out the word should. There's no shoulds in grief. Being present for and listening to someone who's in a crisis is not easy, but it can become a habit with practice. They say that 95% of communication is nonverbal. It's not so much what you say as how you say it, both personally and professionally. Nonverbal communication includes body language like facial expression or posture or silent pauses or eye contact. It's useful, though, to avoid stricken tones. You don't want the grieving person to be responsible for cheering you up, especially if they're trying to carry on as normal. So paying attention to your own body language when supporting a griever is helpful, but it's also important to be able to listen to and read the other person's body language, what they're saying non-verbally. For example, if someone's responding with short answers, it might mean they don't really want to talk in that moment. Sometimes the "I'm in the wings if needed" message is what you want to convey, or at least what I like to convey to people. While driving to work a couple of years ago, I was listening to the John Derringer show on Q107. They were talking about a funeral one of them was going to in the afternoon and discussing what to say and what not to say when going through the receiving line. You'll notice we've discussed many of these before. But I wanted to mention the funeral can sometimes raise some misunderstandings. Consider a woman whose husband has just died. At the funeral or celebration of life, she and her children are enjoying hearing all the stories of her husband, stories she'd never heard before. She's laughing, having a good time. And yet there are some who might view her behavior as scandalous because she's not sad enough. It's important to realize that there's no better or worse emotions. It's just what is in the moment, and all human emotions will be intense at this time. So what are some of the things to consider for the workplace? One thing to know is maybe the organization's bereavement policy. Short-term leave, is there a possibility for that? Can there be a smooth transition back to work? Is it possible to ask the griever what he or she wants made public and what is private? It's also helpful to become a system navigator. Know the organizations in your communities that can offer consultation and support. Be a system navigator of how to access the right support for the right issue at the right time. Know the grief support agencies and psychotherapists in private practice. Reaching out for support if needed is an indicator of excellent self-care. Compassionate Communities philosophy says we're all responsible to and for each other just by virtue of being human. Destigmatizing grief and bringing it into the public domain, where a culture of healing creates safe spaces for grievers to process, with the understanding that it's normal, natural, and necessary to do so, is the Compassionate Communities philosophy. 2 years after her husband's death, Jennifer is in her new normal. She realizes she may have grief bursts occasionally for life. She's become a surfer. She has a small circle of supporters, one of whom she met in a grief group, and others who came forth surprisingly. Her children are thriving as they continue to talk about their father and her husband, and they do rituals on special occasions in his memory. Jennifer knows she'll be okay. She can see grief more easily in others now and comfort them in a sort of pay-it-forward way. She and her children raise funds for cancer now by participating in an annual hike for a local nonprofit. Just a note, though, at the 1-year anniversary of her husband's death, Jennifer felt the grief come back full force. She panicked and wondered what was wrong with her. Did she do something wrong in her grief journey? She booked a session with her grief counselor, connected with her therapeutic third, increased her self-care strategies, and came to understand that it's the rhythm of natural grief that rises up again at times for life. And there's nothing wrong with her except she has the capacity to love. So in summary, if you know someone, including yourself, who's grieving, will you reach out or offer support? Know your own and others' unique talents, gifts, time, and availability? Will you operate from a position of compassion, care, dignity, and respect for everyone, including yourself? Forgive yourself and others for if the attempts aren't perfect, and have faith and trust in the process of grief. At Heart House Hospice, we offer a variety of programs and services available for any resident of Peel grieving the death of a loved one. There's also many organizations in Peel outside Heart House Hospice offering grief support, including, of course, the Dorothy Ley Hospice, funeral homes, Bereaved Families of Ontario, and various church groups. One thing to consider is if a person connects quickly to a grief network, they'll know who to call when the grief hits, even if it's weeks or months down the road. Heart House programs seek to offer many options for grieving persons to decide what to participate in when they're ready. So we have one-on-one professional grief counseling, volunteer support, there are a variety of grief groups, social walking groups, health and wellness groups, grief for children and youth, and so on. And these are the contact information if you ever want to contact us. And then these are just some helpful resources that have been mentioned throughout the presentation today, if you're interested in doing some more research. So thank you. And I just wanted to answer a couple of questions that were brought forward. One of the questions was, how should I respond to people whose comments are unhelpful to me? Well, one of the things to think about is it's not really fair that the grieving person who's in a vulnerable position is often in the position of having to educate others about grief. But for important relationships, it can be helpful. If you're going to consider talking about and educating grief, it's sometimes helpful to externalize the grief. In other words, just sharing, I'm going through a grief journey, and this is what happens in grief, and it takes the pressure off the relationship. It doesn't make it about the relationship and the who's not carrying their part in the relationship. But the other thing to consider is the nature of the relationship with the person who's made the comment. Because with some people, maybe the comment can roll off your back, and maybe in grief, it's, you know, maybe it's a matter of gauging your own energy level and choosing the battles that matter. And there's so many tip sheets out there and things online about how to support someone in grief. It might be helpful to hand that to some people who don't understand the process. Another question sometimes I hear is that, how do I know if I need professional grief counseling? Well, you know, especially now during the pandemic, being isolated geographically from family, from loved ones, there may be people around that have a griever who are very helpful but have never been through grief before. So being with others who are grieving can be helpful. You can get that quickly by accessing grief counseling. Maybe there's other stresses in life. Maybe the death was traumatic, or it's raising something from earlier in life. So grief counseling is available, all kinds of group support, both from Heart House and from Dorothy Ley, when the griever's ready. So there's no hard and fast rule, but it's there if you need it. So that concludes my presentation. Before we end, I'd like to make you aware that there's a link below the video for evaluation. You're welcome to fill it in if you have some comments. We'd like to take as many comments as you're able to give. As well, there's additional resources. If you want to do some more research, be sure to take a look. Thank you.